Welcome back, everybody, to the Wandering Samurai Study, in which we review and analyze every single act told in Rurouni Kenshin, and today's act is Act 40, The Ideal Man. So the first thing that I want to say is kind of in tandem with the previous video, the previous act. Sure, it felt like that last act, there wasn't a whole lot to say, and I was kind of grasping at straws to make it happen. But as far as that act goes, I feel that it was really just part B of the act before it. That those two acts are so much more combined or so much more together than the act that we're going to talk about today. The act that we're going to talk about today feels like a natural progression of the things that happened from the two previous acts that occurred. And that's probably why the material was a little bit light and why it was so much more action. And that's okay. That's fine. These things are bound to happen, and it's a shonen story, so of course there needs to be action from time to time, and I think that it was maybe a little bit needed. I don't necessarily think that, but I know that as a shonen fan, action needs to be there sometimes. How it actually relates to the narrative, I still don't necessarily agree. But like I said, that last act, the whole purpose of it was to show Yutaro Kenshin's strength, and now we get to see the result of Yutaro seeing Kenshin's strength in the previous act. Because where this act takes place, it's 10 days after the events of the last one. So let's get into the chapter summary and we'll go from there. It's been 10 days since the Shinko Ryu attack on the Kamiya dojo, and Yutaro has made himself comfortable continuing to practice Shinai swordsmanship with the begrudging Yahiko. The group goes out to eat, and Karu attempts to invite Yutaro once more to formally join the dojo. Yutaro declines, sharing his story of his first encounter with Raijuta and why it's important for him to train under Raijuta. On the way home, Yutaro asks Kenshin to have an honorable fight in his inevitable rematch with Raijuta, when Raijuta ambushes the group from behind. As I said in the intro bit of the video, the last act really was so that Yutaro can see Kenshin's strength on display. And now that he has, Yutaro is sticking around in the dojo. He's continuing to practice Shinai swordsmanship, though he has a front. And I love the front because it's like any other kid. It's such a kid motivation, or it's such a kid thing for Yutaro to, I guess, say this, because he says that the only reason that he's continuing to practice Shinai swordsmanship, even though he's been completely won over, is because he's there to spy, to infiltrate the group so that he can report back to Raijuta and let them know what kind of man Kenshin is. And of course, Yahiko, living with Kenshin, knowing exactly what kind of man Kenshin is, he says, well, what is there to report? All he does is chores. And the joke that Yutaro calls Kenshin more of a maid than a swordsman is pretty funny. But this reasoning for why he's sticking around, it's such a kid thing, because if it were anybody else, if it was a real motivation, he wouldn't outright say it. He would come up with a more, I guess, compelling reason as to why he's here. It's a lousy front, but because it's coming from such a child, it's funny and it works. It's great. He's putting up a front as to why he's there, which is the Shinai. And if the roles were reversed and Yutaro was more of a sinister character, or he wasn't a child, he would be there, well, I'm here to practice Shinai swordsmanship, and he's actually there to infiltrate and report back to Raijuta about Kenshin. But it's a great joke, and the reasoning behind it is just a nice interaction between Yutaro and Yahiko. But what we get out of it, though, is that Kenshin, all he does is clean the house or do chores and stuff. That's actually a little bit telling, as he doesn't seem to practice his swordsmanship during his leisure time. Instead, he just kind of forgets about it and just does the chores that are required around the house. It's a way of Kenshin earning his keep for sure, and I'm sure that Kaoru would love it since she's not very good at cooking. I am sure that that role kind of like fell down to Kenshin, and I'm sure that he doesn't mind. But that none of that's important. What's important is that Kenshin doesn't practice his swordsmanship during his downtime, and so this makes me kind of wonder that by now we've had two major villains, and we've had somebody as strong as Inosuke come around, and so that's kind of like, he's not actually practicing his swordsmanship? What are you doing? Because you've now had two villains come into the picture like Janae and Aoshi, where they were both really tough situations. Kenshin actually reverted back to the Batosai and he was ready to kill. In the case of Aoshi, he was seriously wounded by the end of that fight. So it just seems a little bit unwise of Kenshin to not keep up with his swordsmanship, or to not fine-tune his attacks, like to not have any training in between the downtime, especially because he expects that out of Yahiko, as mentioned in Act 30 or 31. So let's go ahead and talk about Yutaro a little bit more. Yahiko makes some comments about how this kid didn't even know how to hold a sword 10 days ago, and now he's showing like real potential. Like, I like that Yahiko is able to recognize that he's not so nose up in the air that he can't acknowledge these things about this other character just because he doesn't care for him. Kudos to Yahiko on that, but he kind of is just another version of Yahiko. He's from the first generation of swordsmen where swordsmen aren't around anymore. And I guess it just kind of shows that like a swordsman, the will really does inherit into the next generation. The warrior continues through the next line, whether it's, I guess, in vogue at the time or not. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it just seems natural that even though Yutaro's father threw away the sword, Yutaro has an affinity for it, and he doesn't just have an affinity for it, he has a hidden latency to the sword, that he's able to make such progress within 10 days. But also, had Raijuta actually taken the time to teach Yutaro how to hold a sword and actually train him, Yutaro would be completely in the grasp of Raijuta. But because it's not coming from Raijuta, he is now in a position where he could potentially be taken astray from Raijuta. In this act, though, we see that Yutaro is still very loyal to him, but he's also not completely solid stiff under Raijuta anymore, because now we actually see him venturing off and hanging out with the enemy. So we actually get a visual of the incident that got Yutaro and his father to come in contact with Raijuta, or how Raijuta came into the fold. It was the ambush that Yutaro's father mentioned, but we actually get to see it from the perspective of Yutaro. Yutaro's dad completely cowered out and just begged for their survival, I guess. And so with Raijuta coming in that moment, it completely did exactly what I said in the last not this last video, but the one before it. He has his father figure, his actual dad, that he is disappointed in. He says that the dad brought shame on the family, or he disgraced himself as a swordsman by cowering against the enemy. And then you have a man who strongly values swords come in and just wreck the enemy and just save them. We get an actual visual of why Yutaro is so loyal to him. And that is important because Yutaro has an ideal man in his head. He believes that he knows who his sensei is, and that this is the reason why he won't join the Kamiya dojo, because he's so beholden he has Raijuta on a pedestal, and Raijuta in his eyes can't do anything wrong. And so when the act ends with Raijuta ambushing the group from behind after Yutaro had just asked Kenshin to have an honorable fight with him, it was a little too on the nose. It's to break this ideal version of his sensei. And we'll continue from there as we get into the next act. But man, it's gonna get hard for Yutaro, because everything that's being set up is for Yutaro to see that the man that he's been with is the worst. He's the worst.
No, God!
And we'll see what the ambush leads into in the next act. But for now, this has been Act 40 of Rurouni Kenshin. If you like this video and you want to see more, then consider subscribing to the channel and leave a thumbs up and comment down below what you thought of this act. What did you think of Yutaro in this instance, the ideal man, and then the ambush of Raijuta at the end? When I was reading this one the first time, I was completely shocked by it. I didn't see it coming. But we'll talk in the comments. I'll see you guys next time. Bye, chat.